Every idea you associate with empire, provinces, highways, a professional army, a secret police, resettlement as policy, none of it was invented by Rome. It was invented by 3 small cities on a river in northern Iraq, 1,000 years before Rome existed. And when this empire finally fell, the people it had terrorized didn't just defeat it. They tried to make sure it never existed at all. They burned its capital, smashed its gods, and scrubbed its name so thoroughly off the map that for the next 25 centuries, farmers grazed their sheep on top of buried palaces without the faintest idea what was underneath their feet. I want to be direct about the scale of this. This is the empire that gave the world cavalry, siege warfare, the first library on earth, and the psychological blueprint that Rome, Persia, and honestly, the United States would all later copy without ever fully admitting where it came from. And it did all of that while running the most efficient terror campaign the ancient world had ever seen. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how 3 trading towns turned religious paperwork into a justification for conquering the known world. How one king managed to preserve 4,000 years of human knowledge while keeping rival kings chained like dogs at his palace gate. And why an empire this powerful chose, in the end, to simply disappear, until a broke English lawyer with a shovel and a stubborn streak accidentally dug it back up. This is the story of Assyria. Long before Assyria was an empire, it was just geography. 3 cities, Ashur, Nineveh, and Arbil, sat clustered along the upper Tigris River, exactly where 2 major trade routes crossed. One running from Iran to the Mediterranean coast, the other from Anatolia down into the fertile south. That crossing point made these towns rich as merchants, centuries before they ever became conquerors. Assyrian trading families built commercial outposts hundreds of miles away, in what's now central Turkey, an ancient version of a multinational company, passing routes and contacts down through generations. But northern Mesopotamia had one permanent disadvantage. The soil wasn't nearly as generous as the south. Where Sumer had once flourished on 4 harvests a year, fed by predictable river floods, the north was drier, harder, less forgiving. And that single fact of geography quietly guaranteed something. Sooner or later, Assyria would need to take the south's abundance by force, just to keep feeding itself. Around 1200 BC, that ambition got interrupted by something bigger than any one kingdom. The Bronze Age collapse hit the entire eastern Mediterranean at once. A 2-century stretch of a chain reaction catastrophe that erased the Hittite Empire, crippled Egypt, and knocked Mycenaean Greece so hard that in some places, people simply forgot how to write. Assyria lost almost everything it had built and shrank back down to that original small triangle of 3 cities. But it survived, and that raw stubbornness would end up defining everything the empire became. When the chaos finally lifted, around the 10th century BC, the Assyrians found an unrecognizable region. New peoples had moved in everywhere. Chaldeans in the Babylonian south, Aramean kingdoms scattered across Syria, the early Israelites settled in Canaan, Urartu rising to the north. The old order was gone. But the Assyrians had something almost nobody else did. 300-year-old clay treaty tablets and an absolute, unshakable conviction that those treaties were still legally binding. Here's how it actually worked. Assyrian armies would show up at a city's gates, produce a tablet from 3 centuries earlier, and announce that this city's ancestors had sworn eternal loyalty to Assyria's king. Never mind that everyone involved had died 10 generations ago. To the Assyrians, a written oath was a sacred contract with the gods themselves, and 300 years of unpaid tribute wasn't just a broken promise. It was blasphemy. This wasn't cynical propaganda dressed up as religion. It was their actual theology. Ashur, the supreme Assyrian god, wasn't primarily a war god. He was a god of cosmic order and justice, linked directly to the sun. Sunlight reveals truth. Truth demands justice. Justice demands punishment for anyone who breaks the sacred order. It's a tight, self-reinforcing logical chain, and it turned every single military campaign into a religious obligation rather than a land grab. Which is exactly why Assyrian royal chronicles describe flaying, mutilation, and mass killing in a flat, bureaucratic tone, not gleeful, almost apologetic. This is simply what justice requires. Military dominance on this scale needed new technology, and 2 quiet revolutions during the Bronze Age collapse gave the Assyrians exactly what they needed. First, the domesticated camel, useless in actual combat, but a genuine logistics revolution. Before the camel, an army's range was limited by how far a supply caravan of donkeys and mules could realistically travel. The camel erased that ceiling, and suddenly Assyrian campaigns were reaching Iran, Urartu, the Lebanese coast, and the Persian Gulf, distances that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. Second, the horse. Early Mesopotamian horses were too small to be useful in battle, so donkeys had always been the practical choice. Assyrian breeders changed that, producing larger animals capable of carrying an armed rider, and Assyria became the first civilization to build cavalry into a real military branch. It happened in stages. Early mounted units functioned more like transportation, riders dismounting to fire arrows on foot, while a designated soldier held the horses. By the 8th and 7th centuries, archers were shooting directly from horseback, bareback, no saddle, no stirrups, controlling the animal with their legs alone. This is also, incidentally, why the Assyrians invented trousers. Galloping in a traditional Mesopotamian robe simply didn't work. By the final century of the empire, heavy shock cavalry had emerged, spear-armed riders striking from horseback, the direct ancestor of medieval cavalry, still a few centuries away from the full-mounted lance charge, but unmistakably headed there. Combine that with siege towers, battering rams, and dedicated engineering corps, and you get something genuinely new. The first professional standing army in history, built from trained soldiers rather than farmers pulled off their fields for the season. At its peak, Assyria maintained roughly 200,000 men under arms across its garrisons and provinces, a number most medieval European kingdoms wouldn't approach for another 2,000 years. Feeding a single frontier fortress required close to 80 tons of grain and fodder every single day. This wasn't a raiding culture anymore. It was a logistics machine. But the single most consequential Assyrian innovation wasn't a weapon at all. Starting around 744 BC under King Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyria stopped simply defeating its neighbors and started administering them permanently. Conquered territory fell into 3 tiers. Loyal cities kept their local government entirely intact, same king, same council, provided they followed Assyrian law, fed the garrison, and paid tribute. Cities with questionable loyalty got a puppet ruler, usually pulled from the local opposition, someone who owed his throne entirely to Assyria and would remember exactly who put him there. Actively rebellious cities got something colder. A royal governor deliberately chosen for having no children, meaning he could never found his own dynasty and threaten the crown he served. Assyria was running what amounts to the world's first training academy for colonial administrators. The empire eventually organized into more than 20 provinces, connected by an actual state highway system. Checkpoints, relay stations, royal granaries, maintenance obligations enforced by execution for neglect. Continuous reports flowed back to the capital. This is, functionally, the first bureaucratic empire on Earth. And then there was the policy that genuinely reshaped the ancient world. Mass deportation, not as ethnic cleansing, but as deliberate social engineering. People from the Mediterranean coast were resettled in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamians were sent to the Iranian frontier. One surviving Assyrian governor's report reads simply, "I resettled the Arameans here and counted them all as Assyrians." Deportees received new Assyrian names, tools, livestock, and their old debts were wiped clean. This is worth sitting with for a second. Assyria wasn't just conquering land. It was manufacturing a new, unified identity out of dozens of separate peoples, the exact same logic that would later show up in the Roman citizenship system, in the melting pot idea, in the Soviet concept of a unified Soviet man. All of it traces back, uncredited, to a policy Assyria wrote down 3,000 years ago. This machine had one final architect, and he was strange even by Assyrian royal standards. Ashurbanipal ruled from 668 to 631 BC, and unlike almost every king before him, he had no particular interest in personally leading armies. He delegated that to his generals and stayed in Nineveh, where he read. He'd been trained from childhood by his father's court astrologer, and he was openly, almost boastfully proud of his education, once inscribing that he could read cleverly written texts in obscure Sumerian and in Akkadian, which is difficult to master. Then he did something no ruler before him had ever attempted at scale. He issued a royal decree ordering that clay tablets be gathered from across the entire empire and brought to Nineveh, purchasing valuable texts outright and having scribes copy the rest, each one stamped with history's first known bookplate, warning that anyone who stole a tablet would be struck down by the gods. This is how the library of Ashurbanipal came into existence. Roughly 30,000 tablets, the first systematic archive in human history. Medical texts, legal codes, astronomical records, mathematical problems, Sumerian dictionaries, and, critically, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of literature on Earth, 1,000 years older than Homer. Without this one king's obsession, we would know almost nothing about Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, or the flood myths that would eventually echo through Genesis. Clay turned out to be the perfect archive. Papyrus rots, parchment burns, but a clay tablet baked in a burning palace simply turns into terracotta and survives underground for millennia. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. This same scholar king kept defeated rival kings chained in cages at his palace gates, forcing them to grind the bones of their own ancestors in mortars in full public view. A surviving palace relief shows Ashurbanipal reclining in his garden, sipping wine while servants fan him. And hanging from a nearby tree branch, on a hook through the nose, is the severed head of the king of Elam. The man who single-handedly preserved 4,000 years of human knowledge is the same man in that image. Both things are true about him. Neither one cancels the other out. Ashurbanipal died in 631 BC. 20 years later, the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever produced had ceased to exist entirely. The empire's own chronicles simply stop, without explanation. Everything we know about Assyria's final decade comes from the people who destroyed it, which tells you something on its own. 3 centuries of flayed skin, severed heads, and forced deportations had generated exactly the kind of hatred that stays quiet only as long as the empire stays strong. The moment an alternative appeared, that hatred didn't hesitate. It came from the east. As Median tribes from the Zagros Mountains began attacking the empire's frontier, and almost on cue, Babylon rose up. Babylon had rebelled against nearly every single Assyrian succession for 300 straight years, and it had never stopped resenting its role as the barbarians' cultural trophy. Babylon allied with the Medes, and in 612 BC, their combined armies laid siege to Nineveh. It held for 3 months. When it finally fell, the victors didn't just loot the city, they methodically erased it. The Temple of Ashur, the god around whom the entire Assyrian worldview had been built, was leveled. Royal tombs were dug up and destroyed. Ashur, Nineveh, and Nimrud were flattened. A last-ditch attempt to relocate the capital collapsed by 609 BC. Assyria wasn't simply defeated. It was deliberately, methodically erased, using precisely the same brutal thoroughness the Assyrians themselves had perfected. And then something almost darkly funny happened. On Assyria's ruins, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon rose to glittering new heights, running the exact same playbook. Deportations, provinces, standardized law, the identical Assyrian blueprint down to the administrative details. The Babylonian exile of the Jews was, mechanically, an Assyrian policy carried out by former Assyrian officials using Assyrian procedures. People simply stopped calling it cruel once Babylon was the one doing it. When Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon a few decades later, he didn't invent a new system either. He inherited one, turning Assyrian provinces into Persian satrapies, keeping the roads, keeping the granaries. The blueprint had outlived the people who built it and just kept running under new management. What strikes me most about this isn't the cruelty. Every ancient empire had cruelty. It's how completely the ideas survived the total physical destruction of the civilization that invented them. Assyria itself vanished so thoroughly that 25 centuries later, local farmers were literally grazing sheep on top of buried royal palaces with no memory that anything had ever been there. In 1839, a broke, self-taught English lawyer named Austin Henry Layard was wandering the desert near Mosul, fascinated by the region since childhood through translated tales of the Arabian Nights. He'd taught himself Persian and basic surveying, but had no money and no institutional backing, and returned to Constantinople empty-handed on his first attempt. A few years later, everything changed overnight. A French archaeologist had just uncovered an Assyrian palace, and it became an international sensation. The British couldn't stand to be beaten by the French. An ambassador handed Layard a laughably small sum of money and sent him back out. Layard bought a rifle, told everyone he was going hunting, hired a small crew of local workers, and within 24 hours of digging, had uncovered the walls of 2 entire royal palaces. What followed reshaped how we understand the ancient world. Colossal winged bull statues, thousands of relief panels that had once blazed with paint and reached the modern world bleached white, and finally, room after room, ankle-deep in shattered clay tablets. The library of Ashurbanipal itself, 30,000 clay books that rewrote the timeline of human civilization. Layard shipped the finds down the Tigris on rafts made of inflated goat skins, then 15,000 miles around the African coast, since the Suez Canal didn't exist yet. They sit in the British Museum today. The Assyrian kings, for all their power, ended up smaller than what they invented. Nebuchadnezzar copied their administrative system. Cyrus built Persia's empire directly on top of it. Alexander the Great, arriving in Babylon centuries later, married his generals to local women following the same assimilation logic Assyria had pioneered 1,000 years earlier. Roman provinces, Persian satrapies. Every modern nation's talk of a melting pot. All of it is an echo of decisions made inside a small triangle of 3 cities on the Tigris, 3,000 years ago. And in 2015, ISIS fighters wired the ruins of Nimrud with explosives and detonated them, deliberately destroying palaces that had survived 26 centuries of buried silence. What the Medes and Babylonians couldn't finish in 612 BC, men with suicide vests finished in an afternoon. But 30,000 tablets are still sitting in the British Museum right now. And that's the actual lesson buried underneath all of it. Empires fall. Cities burn. Names get erased so completely that people farm crops directly over the ruins without knowing it. But ideas, the ones written down carefully enough and preserved by even the cruelest of custodians, don't die that easily. Assyria proved that the hard way, twice, once by getting erased, and once by getting remembered anyway.